Some cries for help are spoken out loud, but the ones that change lives forever are often written where nobody thinks to look. Jack Raven Morrison had spent most of his life reading roads instead of people. At 57 years old, he could spot black ice before sunrise, predict a storm from the smell of the wind, and tell whether an engine was healthy by the way it hummed at idle. But people were different. People hid things. They smiled when they were hurting. They waved when they wanted to be left alone. They carried burdens that never appeared on the surface. That Saturday afternoon, the annual Summer Days Festival had transformed the small town of Willow Creek into something that looked like a postcard. Families wandered between food trucks and craft booths. Children carried cotton candy bigger than their heads. Country music drifted through the warm June air, while American flags fluttered from every light pole on Main Street. Jack had only stopped for coffee. That was the plan. Nothing more. He parked his black Harley-Davidson beside a row of classic motorcycles and removed his helmet, setting it carefully on the seat before heading toward a vendor selling fresh roasted coffee. The festival wasn't really his scene anymore. Crowds had a way of reminding him how separate he felt from normal life. Still, there was something peaceful about watching families enjoy an ordinary day. For a few minutes he stood beneath the shade of a maple tree, sipping coffee and listening to distant laughter. Then he noticed her. She couldn't have been older than 8. Blonde hair tied into a loose ponytail. Blue summer dress. White sneakers with tiny scuff marks on the toes. She moved through the crowd carefully, staying close to the edge of walkways instead of running like the other children. What caught Jack's attention wasn't how she looked. It was how often she glanced over her shoulder. Every few seconds, like someone checking whether a storm was following them. The little girl eventually stopped near his motorcycle. Jack watched from a distance as she studied the Harley with wide eyes. Children often did. To them, motorcycles were still magical. She circled the bike once before carefully stepping closer. A moment later, she looked around to see if anyone was watching. Then she smiled softly and touched the handlebars with the kind of wonder usually reserved for museum treasures. Jack almost walked over to say hello, but stopped himself. The girl seemed happy in that moment, relaxed, free for whatever weight lingered behind those cautious eyes. A few minutes later, a man's voice called from somewhere in the crowd. The girl's shoulders immediately stiffened. The smile vanished. She stepped away from the motorcycle and disappeared between groups of festival goers. Jack frowned. Something about the change bothered him, though he couldn't explain why. He finished his coffee and headed back toward the Harley. The afternoon sun reflected from the chrome. Everything looked exactly as he had left it. He picked up his helmet and turned it over. At first he thought it was dirt. Then he noticed the letters. Tiny, uneven, written with what looked like a pencil. For words stretched across the inner lining where only the owner would ever see them. Don't let him take me. Jack froze. The sounds of the festival seemed to fade into the distance. Laughter, music, conversations, all of it blurred beneath the sudden pounding of his heartbeat. He read the message again, then again. The handwriting was unmistakably childish. Small, careful, desperate. For several seconds, he simply stared. Somewhere deep inside him, an old wound reopened. A memory he spent years trying to bury. The image of another young face. Another moment he should have paid attention. Another chance he never got back. Jack slowly lifted his eyes and scanned the crowd. Families moved between booths. Children chased balloons. A dog barked near the fountain. But the little girl was gone. All that remained was the message she had left behind, hidden where nobody else would think to look. And for the first time in years, Jack felt something he thought had disappeared forever. The certainty that somewhere nearby, a child was asking for help. Jack remained beside his motorcycle long after the crowd had moved on, staring at the faint pencil marks inside the helmet, as if they might suddenly explain themselves. The words were simple, yet they carried a weight that settled heavily in his chest. He looked up and scanned the festival again, this time not as a visitor, but as a man searching for someone. The afternoon sun hung low over Willow Creek, casting long golden shadows across Main Street. Families laughed. Children tugged balloons through the warm breeze. Somewhere a local band played an old country song. Everything appeared normal, and somehow that made the message even more unsettling. Whoever had written it had done so in the middle of all this ordinary happiness. Jack slipped the helmet onto the seat and started walking. He moved slowly through the festival grounds, his sharp blue eyes studying every face. 20 years of riding across the country had taught him how to notice details others missed. A nervous glance, a forced smile, a person who seemed out of place. Near the lemonade stand, he spotted the little girl again. Emily Carter stood beside a folding table covered in handmade crafts. She was helping an elderly woman arrange small painted birdhouses while speaking politely to customers. From a distance, she looked like any other child enjoying a summer afternoon. Yet the moment Jack saw her face, he noticed it again. That constant awareness. The way her eyes traveled beyond whoever she was speaking to. The way she checked the crowd every few seconds. Like someone waiting for permission to relax, but never receiving it. Jack approached the booth. Emily noticed him immediately. For a brief moment, surprise flashed across her face. Then came recognition. She remembered the motorcycle. She remembered the helmet. The old woman smiled warmly. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked. "Just looking," Jack replied. His voice was calm, friendly. Emily lowered her gaze toward the birdhouses. "Those are nice," Jack said. "Did you paint them?" Emily nodded. "Some of them." "You did a good job." A faint smile appeared. Small, careful, gone almost as quickly as it arrived. Before Jack could say anything else, Emily's attention shifted toward the other side of the street. Her shoulders tightened instantly. Jack followed her gaze. A man stood near a pickup truck parked beside the courthouse lawn. Mid-40s, clean-cut appearance, polo shirt, sunglasses. To anyone else, he looked perfectly ordinary. But Emily's reaction told a different story. She immediately looked down at the table and began rearranging birdhouses that did not need rearranging. The man raised a hand and waved. Emily waved back, though her smile never reached her eyes. Jack felt a knot form in his stomach. A few minutes later, the man crossed the street. "There you are," he said cheerfully. "Ready to head home?" Emily hesitated. Not enough for most people to notice. Just half a second. Then she nodded. "Yes, sir." Jack noticed the choice of words. Not dad, not daddy, not even father. Just sir. The man placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. "Come on. We have a long drive." Emily obeyed immediately. No complaint, no argument. Yet as she turned to leave, her eyes briefly met Jack's. The expression lasted less than a heartbeat. Fear, hope, uncertainty. Then it was gone. She climbed into the passenger seat of the pickup truck. The vehicle pulled away from the curb and disappeared beyond the courthouse. Jack remained standing beside the booth. The elderly woman sighed softly. "Sweet girl," she said. "Always so helpful." Jack glanced toward the road. "Family." The woman hesitated before answering. "Her mother passed away 3 years ago. She lives with her stepfather now, Derek Sloan." Jack watched the empty street where the truck had vanished. The name settled into his memory. Around him, the festival continued as if nothing unusual had happened. Music played. Children laughed. Vendors called out to customers. Yet deep inside, the uneasy feeling refused to leave. Because when Emily had looked at him from that truck window, she had not looked like a child heading home. She had looked like someone silently asking whether anybody had finally seen what everyone else had missed. Jack did not leave Willow Creek that evening. Long after the festival lights began shutting down and vendors folded their tents, he remained parked outside a small diner overlooking Main Street. The coffee in front of him had gone cold nearly an hour earlier. Through the window, he watched the town settle into its familiar rhythm. Pickup trucks rolled home. Porch lights flickered on. Families gathered around dinner tables. It looked peaceful, safe. Yet the message inside his helmet refused to leave his mind. He had spent years teaching himself not to dwell on things he could not change. Some regrets were too heavy to carry forever. Others never truly left. As the sky darkened beyond the diner windows, one particular memory surfaced again. It always began with a laugh. A little girl standing on a dock beside a lake nearly 25 years earlier. Her blonde hair dancing in the summer wind. Her tiny fishing rod almost bigger than she was. Lily Morrison had inherited her mother's smile and her father's stubbornness. Back then, Jack was not known as Raven. He was simply a young father trying to balance family. Life with long stretches on the road. Lily had adored motorcycles. Every time he returned home, she would run across the yard and throw her arms around his waist before he even shut off the engine. For years, Jack believed there would always be another ride, another weekend, another chance to make memories. Then life started moving faster. Work became complicated. Responsibilities grew heavier. Small promises became easier to postpone. One evening, Lily had asked him to attend a school event. She had been excited for weeks. She even drew him a handmade invitation covered in glitter and crooked stars. Jack promised he would be there. He meant it when he said it. But that afternoon, a series of unexpected problems pulled him in another direction. By the time he finished dealing with them, the event was over. Lily never complained. She simply smiled and said she understood. Looking back, that smile haunted him more than anger ever could have. It was the smile of a child trying to be brave. Months later, circumstances changed again. Life became complicated in ways neither of them expected. Opportunities to reconnect slipped away one by one until distance grew where closeness once existed. Years passed. Calls became less frequent. Holidays became harder to coordinate. Eventually, Jack found himself carrying a quiet guilt he never learned how to erase. Not because he had done something terrible, because he had failed to notice how much a child needed someone to truly see them. The memory followed him as he drove through Willow Creek later that night. Streetlights reflected across his windshield. Every time he pictured Emily's face, he saw the same thing. Not fear alone, loneliness, the kind that settled into someone when they felt invisible. Near midnight, he parked outside a small motel on the edge of town. Sleep should have come easily after a long day. It never did. He sat on the edge of the bed and opened a weathered storage box he carried during nearly every trip. Inside were old photographs, faded letters, and keepsakes most people would have thrown away years ago. Carefully, he pulled out a photograph. Lily at 9 years old, standing beside his motorcycle, smiling at the camera. Jack stared at the image for a long moment. Then he noticed something he had not thought about in years. On the back of the photograph, Lily had written a note in pencil, just a few simple words. Nothing dramatic, nothing alarming. Yet the handwriting instantly reminded him of the message inside the helmet. Small letters, careful strokes, a child trying to communicate something important. Jack closed his eyes. The realization hit him harder than he expected. Children rarely asked for help the way adults imagined they would. They left clues, small ones, easy to miss. A drawing, a note, a look across a crowded room. Emily had not chosen his helmet by accident. She had chosen the one place she knew he would eventually see. And for the first time in 25 years, Jack made a promise he intended to keep. Whatever truth lay behind those frightened eyes, he was not going to look away. The next morning arrived with clear skies and the kind of sunshine that made Willow Creek look almost perfect. Jack knew appearances could be deceiving. Small towns were good at protecting their image. People preferred neat stories, simple explanations, and comfortable assumptions. It was easier that way. Easier to believe everything was fine than to ask difficult questions. After breakfast at the diner, Jack began walking through town. He was not looking for evidence. He was looking for patterns. The first stop was the hardware store near the courthouse. The owner, a gray-haired man named Walter Briggs, had lived in Willow Creek his entire life. Jack bought a bottle of water and casually mentioned Emily Carter. Walter immediately recognized the name. "Sweet kid," he said. "Always polite. Always says thank you." Then something changed. The smile faded slightly. "Quiet, though." Jack nodded. "What do you mean?" Walter glanced toward the front window before answering. "She just never seemed like other kids. Most children run around and cause trouble. Emily always looked like she was worried about something." That was the first time Jack heard it. Worried. 2 blocks later, he visited the public library. The librarian, Mrs. Benson, remembered Emily instantly. "One of our best readers," she said proudly. "She comes here every week." Jack asked what kinds of books she liked. Adventure stories mostly. Books about brave children solving problems. Mrs. Benson paused. "Funny thing, though." "What is it?" Jack asked. Every time I asked if everything was all right at home, she would smile and say yes. But she always answered too quickly. The same feeling returned. Like everyone had noticed something, yet nobody had fully examined it. By noon, Jack found himself sitting on a bench outside the elementary school. Summer vacation had already started, but a few staff members were organizing materials for the next semester. One teacher agreed to speak with him. Her name was Rebecca Martin. She taught 3rd grade. The moment Emily's name came up, Concern appeared in her eyes. She is one of the brightest students I have ever taught, Rebecca said quietly. Kind, respectful, exceptionally mature. Mature, Jack repeated. Too mature. Rebecca folded her hands together. Children should not have to carry the weight Emily carries. Sometimes she looked exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. Jack listened carefully. Did she ever ask for help? Rebecca hesitated. Not directly, but Rebecca sighed. There were little things. Jack leaned forward. What kind of things? Assignments about family always made her nervous. She never talked much about home. If another student mentioned parents, she would suddenly become quiet. Rebecca stared out the window toward the empty playground. One time I asked her what made her feel safe. What did she say? She said libraries. The answer lingered between them. Not home, not family. Libraries. A place where people whispered, rules were clear, and nobody expected anything from her. As the afternoon passed, Jack spoke with more people. A church volunteer, a waitress, a crossing guard, different ages, different backgrounds. Yet every conversation revealed another small piece of the same puzzle. Emily was polite. Emily was thoughtful. Emily seemed older than her years. Emily always looked over her shoulder. Emily rarely laughed for long. Emily seemed relieved whenever she spent time away from home. None of it sounded dramatic. None of it qualified as proof. But together those observations painted a picture that troubled Jack deeply. What unsettled him most was not what people knew. It was what they had done with that knowledge. Nothing. Everyone carried a fragment of concern. No one carried responsibility. As evening settled over Willow Creek, Jack sat alone beside his motorcycle outside the motel. The town glowed beneath the orange light of sunset. Children rode bicycles down quiet streets. Porch lights flickered on one by one. Somewhere beyond those peaceful neighborhoods, Emily was spending another night behind a door nobody seemed willing to question. And for the first time, Jack realized the problem might not be that people failed to see the signs. The problem was that they had seen them and convinced themselves somebody else would act. The following morning began with a question Jack could not shake. If Emily had written one message inside his helmet, had she tried to leave others behind? Children rarely placed all their hope into a single attempt. They tested the world first, quietly, carefully, hoping someone would notice. The thought followed him back to the public library shortly after opening. Mrs. Benson greeted him with a warm smile and a fresh cup of coffee. When he explained that he was trying to understand Emily better, the librarian led him toward the children's reading section. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating shelves packed with adventure novels and well-loved classics. Everything felt peaceful, safe. Yet Jack remembered what Rebecca Martin had said. When Emily was asked where she felt safest, she answered with a single word. Libraries. Mrs. Benson stopped beside a small corner table. This was her favorite spot, she said. Every Tuesday after school. Jack looked at the chair, tucked neatly beneath the table. A stack of returned books rested nearby. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. Then Mrs. Benson reached into a drawer and removed a folded piece of paper. I almost forgot about this. Jack unfolded it carefully. It was a drawing. Crayons. Colored pencils. The kind of artwork adults often glance at for a few seconds before moving on. A small house sat beneath a bright blue sky. A tree stood beside a fence. At first glance it looked cheerful. Then Jack noticed something. Every window on the house had bars drawn across it. Not realistic bars. Childlike bars. Deliberate. Repeated. Mrs. Benson sighed softly. Emily drew that 3 months ago. Jack studied the picture in silence. Did anyone ask her about it? Of course. What did she say? She smiled and said she liked drawing windows. The answer lingered in the quiet room. Later that afternoon, Jack visited the church downtown. The volunteer coordinator recognized Emily immediately. Wonderful child, she said. Always helping. She disappeared into a storage room and returned holding a cardboard box filled with old activity sheets from youth events. She loved writing little notes during craft days. Jack carefully flipped through the papers. Most contained simple things. Favorite colors. Dream vacations. Lists of animals she liked. Then he found one folded twice and tucked between 2 worksheets. In neat pencil, handwriting Emily had written a single sentence. Sometimes people smile because they do not know what else to do. Jack stared at the words. Not because they sounded dramatic, because they sounded far older than 8 years old. The volunteer shook her head sadly. When I read that, I thought she was just unusually thoughtful. By evening, Jack had collected more fragments. None of them seemed important alone. Together, they formed a pattern impossible to ignore. At the library, he discovered a returned bookmark where Emily had written the word help and then scribbled over it until the letters nearly disappeared. At the church, there were thoughtful notes that hinted at loneliness. At school, Rebecca Martin remembered a journal assignment where Emily described bravery not as fighting monsters, but as asking someone to believe you. Everywhere Jack looked, he found traces of the same thing. A child trying to communicate. A child testing whether anybody was listening. The most heartbreaking discovery came just before sunset. Mrs. Benson called it back to the library after finding something tucked inside an old adventure novel Emily had borrowed several times. It was a tiny piece of notebook paper folded into a square no bigger than a postage stamp. Jack unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was unmistakable. Small, neat, hopeful. The note contained only 4 words. Please notice me this time. Jack lowered the paper slowly. Outside the library window, families walked through the golden evening light. Cars rolled peacefully down Main Street. The town looked exactly as it always had. Yet in his hands rested proof that for months, maybe longer, Emily had been leaving pieces of herself behind like breadcrumbs scattered through the places where she felt safest. Not because she wanted attention, because she wanted someone to understand what she could not bring herself to say out loud. 3 days passed without a single new clue. For Jack, that silence felt louder than any warning bell. Every morning, he checked the library. Every afternoon, he drove past the church. Every evening, he watched the streets of Willow Creek as families returned home from work and children rode bicycles beneath the fading summer sun. He never expected answers to arrive easily. Still, something felt different. The invisible thread he had been following was suddenly pulling tight. On Thursday morning, Rebecca Martin called him before 8 o'clock. The concern in her voice was impossible to miss. Jack, I thought you should know something. He sat upright immediately. What happened? The summer reading program started today. Okay. A pause followed. Emily did not show up. Jack frowned. Maybe she is sick. No, Rebecca said quietly. Emily never misses reading days. An hour later, he was standing outside the library speaking with Mrs. Benson. The elderly librarian looked troubled. She always comes on Thursdays, she said. Always. The empty chair in the corner seemed strangely noticeable now. The books Emily usually borrowed remained untouched on the shelf. The place where she had once spent entire afternoons reading adventure stories suddenly felt abandoned. By noon, Jack visited the small grocery store near the edge of town. The cashier recognized Emily immediately. I had not seen her all week, she admitted. That is unusual. Another piece of the puzzle slid into place. One person missing a child could be coincidence. Several people noticing the same absence was something else entirely. Late that afternoon, Jack drove past the small house where Emily lived with Derek Sloan. The curtains were closed. The driveway was empty. A real estate sign stood near the mailbox. Freshly planted, bright and impossible to miss. Jack slowed his motorcycle. Something about the sign felt wrong. 2 days earlier, there had been no indication the property was for sale. Now the house looked as though its occupants had vanished overnight. Across the street, an elderly neighbor sat watering flowers. Jack approached carefully. Excuse me, ma'am. The woman lowered her watering can. Can I help you? Jack pointed toward the house. Do you know if the family moved? The woman nodded slowly. That is what Derek told everyone. When? A couple of days ago. Did he say where they were going? No. Her expression darkened. Just said a new job opportunity came up. Jack glanced back toward the house. The explanation sounded neat. Too neat. Did Emily seem excited? He asked. The woman hesitated. Honestly, yes. She looked scared. The answer settled heavily in his chest. That evening, Jack returned to the motel, carrying more questions than answers. The sky outside turned deep orange before fading into purple. Crickets chirped beyond the parking lot. Everything appeared calm, yet the feeling inside him continued to grow. Around 9 o'clock, his phone rang. It was Rebecca again. Jack, she said, you need to hear this. What is it? 1. of the school office assistants remembered something. Jack stood immediately. Go on. 3 days ago, Derek came by to collect Emily's school records. Jack felt his pulse quicken. Why? He told them she would be attending a different school. Did he say where? No, silence followed. Then Rebecca spoke again. Jack, I've worked with children for 20 years. And when families move, children usually talk about it. They talk about new bedrooms, new schools, new friends. Her voice grew softer. Emily never mentioned moving. Not once. After the call ended, Jack walked outside and stared across the dark highway stretching beyond Willow Creek. Every instinct he possessed told him the clock had started ticking. The notes, the drawings, the hidden messages, the frightened glances. None of them felt distant anymore, because now the child who had spent months trying to be noticed was suddenly gone. And somewhere beyond the quiet streets of Willow Creek, Emily Carter was no longer leaving clues behind. Jack spent most of the night staring at a county map spread across the small table in his motel room. Red circles marked places connected to Emily's life. The library, the school, the church, the house she had disappeared from. Every road leading out of Willow Creek seemed to stretch endlessly into uncertainty. Around 2 a.m, he finally reached for his phone. There was only one person he trusted when something truly mattered. Marcus Steele answered on the second ring. Raven, sorry to wake you. You never call this late unless it is important. Jack looked down at the folded notes he had collected over the past week. Emily's drawings, her messages, her quiet attempts to be heard. There's a little girl who needs help. Silence filled the line for a moment. Marcus knew Jack well enough to hear the weight behind those words. Tell me everything. For nearly an hour, Jack explained what he had learned. The notes hidden in books, the drawing with barred windows, the sudden disappearance, the house placed on the market overnight, the frightened looks nobody else seemed willing to acknowledge. When he finished, Marcus remained quiet. You think she is in danger? He finally asked. I think she spent months trying to tell people something was wrong. Another pause followed. Then Marcus spoke with calm certainty. Where are you? Willow Creek. Be ready tomorrow morning. The call ended. Jack did not ask questions. He already knew the answer. At sunrise, the town awoke to a sound nobody expected. The distant rumble began low on the horizon. At first, people mistook it for approaching thunder. But the sky was clear. By 8 o'clock, residents, standing on front porches, noticed motorcycles entering town from every direction. One by one they arrived. Then 10 at a time. Then entire groups riding together in perfect formation. Chrome reflected the morning sunlight. Engines hummed steadily along Main Street. Store owners stepped outside. Customers paused in parking lots. Curtains shifted behind living room windows. Nobody understood what was happening. By 9 o'clock, nearly 50 motorcycles were parked around the courthouse square. Yet there was no shouting, no disruption, no confrontation. The riders removed their helmets, greeted one another respectfully, and gathered beneath the shade of old oak trees. They looked less like an invading force and more like a community answering a call. Jack stood beside Marcus near the courthouse fountain. I did not ask for this many, he admitted. Marcus smiled slightly. Neither did I. Across the square, men and women from different chapters exchanged information. Some had backgrounds in construction. Others worked as mechanics, teachers, nurses, business owners, and veterans. Several spent their careers helping families navigate difficult situations. What united them was not anger. It was purpose. Marcus held up one of Emily's notes. The small piece of paper passed carefully from hand to hand. Each writer studied the handwriting, the simple message, the unmistakable voice of a child hoping someone would finally listen. Nobody is here to cause problems, Marcus said. We are here because a little girl asked for help, even if she never knew who would hear her. Throughout the morning, they organized quietly. Writers searched public records. Others contacted friends in neighboring counties. Some visited local businesses gathering information about recent moving trucks, rental properties, or vehicle sightings. Every lead mattered. Every possibility deserved attention. Around town, reactions shifted from curiosity to understanding. People who had once dismissed their concerns about Emily began stepping forward. A waitress remembered a conversation. A church volunteer recalled an address mentioned months earlier. A delivery driver recognized Derek Sloan's truck from a nearby county. Small pieces of information started connecting. For the first time, Willow Creek itself seemed determined to act. By early afternoon, Jack stood at the edge of the courthouse lawn watching dozens of motorcycles glimmer beneath the summer sun. He thought about Emily sitting quietly in library corners, leaving notes where she hoped someone might find them, wondering whether anybody cared enough to notice. She could never have imagined this scene. 50 writers, an entire town awakening, strangers joining together because one child's voice refused to disappear. And as another lead arrived from a neighboring county, Jack realized something important. Emily was no longer searching for someone willing to listen. Now there were hundreds. The breakthrough arrived just before sunset. A delivery driver from a neighboring county contacted one of the writers after seeing a photograph of Derek Sloan's truck. He remembered the vehicle parked outside a small rental property on Cedar Road, nearly 40 miles from Willow Creek. The house sat at the end of a narrow gravel lane, surrounded by tall pines and overgrown grass. It was the kind of place people passed without noticing. Within an hour, the information had been verified through public records. The property had been rented only days earlier under Derek's name. For the first time since Emily disappeared, the uncertainty began to lift. Jack rode at the front of a small group as they traveled towards Cedar Road. The evening sky glowed orange and gold above the rolling countryside. No one rushed. No one acted recklessly. They understood that helping a child required patience, clarity, and the right people involved at the right time. Marcus had already contacted local authorities and child welfare professionals, sharing everything that had been gathered over the previous week. The notes, the drawings, the statements from teachers, librarians, neighbors, and volunteers. What had once seemed like isolated observations now formed a clear picture when viewed together. By the time they reached the area, trained professionals were already on their way. Jack parked beneath a cluster of pine trees, overlooking the property. The house appeared quiet. A porch light glowed near the front door. Wind stirred the branches overhead. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Then a vehicle slowly approached from the opposite direction. It was not law enforcement. It was someone unexpected. An older woman stepped out carrying a worn leather purse and several folders pressed tightly against her chest. Her name was Linda Mercer. She introduced herself to the group and immediately asked if they were there because of Emily. Jack nodded. Linda's eyes filled with emotion. She explained that she had once been a close friend of Emily's late mother. For years, she had tried to remain connected to the child, but gradually lost contact after the mother's passing. Recently, she had become concerned. Very concerned. From her purse, she produced copies of letters, emails, and records documenting repeated attempts to check on Emily's well-being. Some had never received responses. Others had been redirected. Combined with everything already collected, the information became impossible to ignore. Shortly afterward, the authorities arrived. Conversations followed. Documents were reviewed. Questions were asked. The process moved carefully, respectfully, and according to the law. Jack remained near the edge of the property, watching the final rays of sunlight disappear beyond the trees. He had spent days imagining this moment, yet none of it felt dramatic. It felt important. Quietly important. Eventually the front door opened. A child stepped onto the porch. For a moment Jack barely recognized her. Emily looked smaller somehow. Tired. Uncertain. Then she spotted him standing near the motorcycles. Her eyes widened. Neither of them moved. They simply looked at one another across the fading evening light. Emily was the first to smile. It was not the cautious smile he remembered from the festival. It was small but genuine. The kind that appears when someone finally realizes they are no longer carrying a burden alone. Nearby, adults continued their conversations. Plans were being made. Safe arrangements were being discussed. People trained to help children were ensuring every next step will be handled properly. Jack did not need to hear the details. He could already see the change beginning. The fear that had once followed Emily everywhere seemed to loosen its grip. As darkness settled across Cedar Road, the child who had hidden messages inside library books, drawings, and even a motorcycle helmet was finally surrounded by people willing to listen. And for the first time in a very long while, Emily no longer needed to leave clues behind. 1 year later, Willow Creek looked different to Jack Morrison. Not because the buildings had changed or the roads had been repaved. The town itself was much the same. The difference lived in the small moments people often overlooked. The library was busier. Community events felt warmer. Neighbors greeted one another more often. It was as if one child's courage had reminded an entire town that paying attention mattered. The Summer Days Festival had returned, bringing music, food trucks, and colorful booths back to Main Street. Families filled the sidewalks beneath bright blue skies. Children laughed as they chased balloons through the crowd. The scent of barbecue drifted through the warm afternoon air. Jack parked his Harley in nearly the same spot where everything had begun a year earlier. He stood beside the motorcycle for a moment, taking in the sound around him. A year ago, he had arrived, carrying old regrets and a belief that some mistakes could never be repaired. Life had a strange way of proving people wrong. Across the festival grounds, a group of children gathered near the community stage. Among them stood Emily Carter. She was taller now, more confident. Her smile appeared easily instead of cautiously. The nervous habit of constantly looking over her shoulder had disappeared. She laughed with friends her own age and moved through the crowd with the freedom every child deserved. When she spotted Jack, her face immediately lit up. "Raven!" she shouted before running across the grass. Several people turned and smiled as she threw her arms around him. Jack laughed and hugged her carefully. "Well, look at you," he said. "You are growing faster than a summer cornfield." Emily grinned. "That is what everyone keeps saying." Behind her stood Linda Mercer, who had become an important part of Emily's life over the past year. Nearby, teachers, neighbors, librarians, and church volunteers exchanged greetings. Many of them had remained involved long after that evening on Cedar Road. They had learned something important from Emily. Caring was not a single moment. It was a commitment. Later that afternoon, the festival organizers invited Emily onto the community stage to recognize several local volunteers. Standing beneath the bright sunlight, she thanked teachers, librarians, neighbors, and everyone who had helped her. Her voice remained steady despite the large crowd. Then she looked toward Jack. "There is one person I want to thank especially," she said. Hundreds of eyes turned in his direction. Jack immediately felt uncomfortable. Attention had never been his favorite thing. Emily smiled. Because he listened. The crowd applauded softly. Jack lowered his head, embarrassed and honored at the same time. After the ceremony ended, Emily disappeared for several minutes before returning with a gift wrapped in blue paper. "This is for you," she said. Jack accepted the package carefully. "What is it?" "Open it." Inside was a brand new motorcycle helmet. Black, polished, beautifully finished. For a moment, Jack could not speak. Then he noticed Emily pointing toward the inside lining. Slowly, he turned the helmet over. Hidden where only the owner would see was a handwritten message. The letters were still small, still careful, but they no longer carried fear. They carried gratitude. Jack read the words silently. "You did not let him take me. You helped me find my way home." His vision blurred for a moment. Around them, the festival continued. Music played. Children laughed. Life moved forward. Yet for Jack, time seemed to pause. Because the little girl who once believed nobody could hear her had found her voice. And the man who spent years regretting the moments he missed had finally kept a promise when it mattered most. As the afternoon sun cast golden light across Willow Creek, Emily slipped her hand into his and looked toward the crowd. This time neither of them needed to search for signs. They were surrounded by people who had learned the value of listening. And sometimes Jack realized that was how lives changed. Not through grand gestures or dramatic moments, but because one person noticed a quiet message and chose not to look away.